First of all, I'm going to say I haven't done this for about 2.5 to 3 years, so if I go a bit off-piste, bear with me. I'm going to be looking at potential strategies for documenting experiential installations. So all of my work is for participants. It's not for me, it's not for people, it's just for people to engage with. And until recently, this has seemed to be something of an unattainable dream. How do you document the experiential? However, with recent developments in the field of VR, I think we might be getting a little closer to it. I've always been dissatisfied, as most of us have, in the visual documentation of works such as installations, which are video and photographs, which inevitably give a view of the observer, but not the sensation of the participant. And of course, that is almost impossible to do. So you can't actually, by looking at this stuff, you can't see. So you don't get an idea of what it felt like to be inside the installation, and that's what the installations are about. They're not about being looked at necessarily. So it occurs to me that if dance historians or even future artists or students or anybody wants to know what these installations are about, we've got to find another way of documenting them. And I think VR is beginning to get the capabilities of doing that. In an early experiment with VR documentation, which is here, in this early experiment, a colleague of mine in Chichester and I tried to do a VR version of an installation called Fugitive Moments. Now, it was about the movement of colour. It was quite a long experiment. It was quite a nice installation, but you didn't get very much of it from the VR environment. You could navigate through it, but you didn't get a sense of the texture of the digital imagery, and that's really what the installation was about. This was displayed on a 2D screen, so again, you're looking at it from outside rather than walking up to it and through it. With the video documentation, you actually got more of an embodied sense of what the installation felt like than the VR. But of course, you couldn't navigate your own way through it. You had to go wherever the camera took you. So what I wanted to do was to find a way that you could actually navigate your way through an installation and get the sensations that they were generating. Another installation, which I think I'm going to be talking about quite a lot, was Senseless Geographies. It was created in 2003. It was immersive, it was participatory, it was interactive, it was all of those things. When engaging in this work, the sound was essential. You had to focus on the sound, not on anything else. And here you see two people. This is the first version of it, and they've got blindfolds on. It asks the participants to attend to their kinesthetic and proprioceptive responses to the environment, which was the sonic environment. However, that environment, they were generating themselves as they moved. So their movement through the space both generated, modulated, and changed the textures of the sound environment they were working in. And I'll go on to a bit more of that later. So what I want to see if it's possible to find a way of doing is simulating this experience that these people were getting in a virtual world. Now, I think with the advent of head-mounted displays, advances in audio-visual rendering and interactive capabilities in games engines, we made the first one in an open-source games engine. With these advances in audio-visual rendering, but more significantly in the increasing attention that's being paid by VR developers to the interplay between the perceptual senses and the role this plays in the experience of our environment. But how are we going to do that? Oh dear, this is the thing. Be halfway between. When using HMDs, the players are entirely embraced by the virtual world's environment. Just as in the real world, there is no edge of vision. So whenever I turn, there's always something there. It doesn't stop as it does on a screen or even in a cave environment. You get a sense of experience the breadth the height, the depth, and the width of the world you're in, just as we do in the real world. There's no break to the flow of the illusion with an HMD of the body being enfolded in the environment. But where would a VR representation of an immersive art installation viewed through an HMD stand in relation to the real world version? We engage in an intricate interplay with our environment in installations in the real world. Not only one that affects how and where we move, but also the one that affects our perceptions and our sense of being. This is even more of the case in an immersive installation, which are designed to enhance the visitor's attention to the more nuanced, effective elements of their environment. Now, obviously, we can't replicate experience in virtual reality. Everybody's individual experience is individual. But we could create the relevant perceptual conditions to initiate a similar experience to that experienced in the real-world environment. And it is to these perceptual conditions that I'm now going to turn very briefly. The importance of the way our perceptual systems operate cannot be overemphasized when developing virtual worlds. Perceptual experience is generated by an intricate dynamic network of sensory systems. This results in a complex, highly integrated, multi-channel system that absorbs and interprets complex environmental information from all the senses simultaneously, come in Gibson, of course. At any moment, all the perceptual channels are simultaneously acting upon each other and being acted upon by the others, though that there's no separation between the channels. They're all affecting each other as you move. And of equal significance, they are being affected and acted upon by their environment. This is an ongoing thing that happens. So the shifting orientation and proximity of features of an environment that are generated by our movement impact on all of our perceptual responses. Now, we use the same perceptual clues to estimate position, orientation, and affective responses in a virtual world as we do in the real world. And therefore, all the details of the environment must be considered when we're developing such a world. Now, to build a virtual world with affective tone, and that's what we're after, one that gives a rich embodied response, and this is what we were talking about in relation to museums earlier, we need to attend to all those perceptual channels. We need to build a realistically rendered visual representation of the installation environment in all its optical subtlety, including the play of light and intensity of the effective tone generated by the light. This VR developers called the plenoptic function, and there's some writings on it that I've been working on over the last few weeks that if anybody's interested, they can get access to. However, Larson and his colleagues in 2001 revealed that the effective tone and spatial awareness of a VR environment are contingent on information derived from both the visual and the oral senses. So they're acting together. It's not just the visual sense. They realized, and they did experiments, and found that the mismatch between the sonic and visual perceptual clues in a virtual world measurably reduced the sense of presence of its visitors. Hence, a rendering of a spatially distributed, multi-layered sonic environment which stimulates, and here's the technical bit, the spatio-temporal acoustic pressure field of an environment. This flows from this shaping, I'll add that bit, which flows from the volume and shaping of the environment, is needed if you're going to generate a rich, plenacoustic environment. So this and other people called an environment's acoustic footprint. Now, if you bring a sound into an environment, a virtual environment, that takes the acoustic footprint of the original, it changes the quality of the sound. If you put it into a different acoustic footprint, the sound will sound different. And that's an important thing to recognize in the virtual world. So the multidimensionality of sound is an integral fact of any environment, virtual or otherwise. We also need to give players full control of their movement in the virtual space by providing a navigational interface that allows them to navigate the space intuitively, the virtual world intuitively. Now, I don't know about you, but actually using arrows on a keyboard is one of the most unintuitive ways I've found of trying to navigate around a world. Joysticks a little better, but not much. So it also needs one that gives a realistic sense of the kinesthetic engagement with the virtual environment. Again, this is something we were talking about earlier. Now, this video here, which was made in 2014, it's a virtual art gallery, shows that VR often doesn't engage at that kinesthetic level. You glide through an environment. You don't walk through, you don't feel as if you're going through. You're just sliding through the environment, which is missing all the proprioceptive clues that the regular environment gives. Now, a guy called Norbert Nietzsche and his colleagues addressed this issue directly in developing an interface that would take account of the kinesthetic and proprioceptive feedback we get from the real world. They argued that walking in a virtual environment requires the same estimations of orientation and position as in the real world, and that therefore the proprioceptive and kinesthetic senses are an essential element of spatial perception there too. For this reason, they are a prerequisite of navigation in a virtual environment. In order to create the conditions that would allow people to use the full gamut of their kinesthetic and proprioceptive responses in the virtual environment, he built a real-world user environment, which allowed him to test the idea that actually using your physicality with an HMD on would mean that you could be more embedded in the virtual world, if you like. So he asked the users to don an HMD. He linked them with a computer. As you can see, a great big thing going up here. This was done in about 2001, I think. We'd now use a smartphone, no doubt, tucked in our back pocket. They then navigated this much larger virtual world. The figure would have been about that big, using their regular walking in this restricted space. Now, that would seem impossible. Would have been impossible, they'd hit the wall. So what he did was he created something called a motion compression algorithm, which enabled people to walk as in the virtual world, straightforward like this, but in fact, their orientation in this real space, and don't ask me how it worked, I don't know, made them go round in a circle. So they could actually navigate this virtual world, feeling as if they were going way out into the distance in this tiny little space here. Now, this is being called extended range telepresence and is beginning to be adopted and adapted in contemporary VR systems, especially ones that use treadmills or whatever. So that it's beginning to be used. And then finally, we need to port a version of an original interactive system in an interactive installation into the VR system to modulate the environment as you move, if that's what was happening. At a basic level, this is achievable, I think. But Morcillo and his colleagues have demonstrated that's a real-world version of a Nam June Paik installation called Versailles Fountain. They built one in the real world, and this just shows you, he says that you can get a real lived experience in VR. Using this technology. So the guy's looking up from position A. He's looking down from a different position. He's looking straight ahead from position A again. So you can actually interact with this world, by which basically they mean navigating around. I think there was something in this that they could change something in that. I think it was slightly interactive, but it wasn't really clear from the article. So we now get, so far so good, the technology is out there. I suspect it's tucked away in Karlsruhe, because a lot of this work was done in Karlsruhe, or MIT, which is another place. But some of it is available, and it would be possible to start to think about documenting experiential installations in VR in such a way that you could get a sensation. Now I'm going to use sensuous geographies as a possible example. It would make a great case study for research if somebody wanted to sort of engage in this. It was immersive, interactive, multi-user. The interface was sound, as I've said, and not the visual sense. The interactive system had several levels, as in a game. You could be a single user, interact with your own sound as you traveled through the space. You could engage in collective interactivity with duets, trios, or quartets. We couldn't go further than 4 in that particular environment. The material environment constituted 2 environments. I wonder if I've moved on. One embraced the other. I think I might be moving on to the next one. And that's an example of the raw environment before all the lights went down. So you could actually build that environment, and that would give you your acoustic footprint. That would give you your sound world. Now there's an outer environment, which is really what we're looking at here. We're looking from the outer environment, which is behind those screen things. Now all the way around the room, there were speakers, 4 speakers, which gave a sense of the travelling, the spatialisation of the sound and the changing textures that the people inside were changing in response to their directions and velocity. Now, I reckon that this would test Morsillo's claim that multimodal devices and the adoption of advances in VR technology, such as attention to the plenoptic, plenacoustic, and plenhaptic functions, would allow this lifelike experience. As I've said, the visual environment wouldn't be too difficult to model, and it would give the acoustic footprint. You could incorporate the content of the digital content of the audiovisual world fairly easy into a virtual environment. Emulating the nature of that sonic world might be more difficult, but an electroacoustic composer friend of mine assures me that it's not impossible. But one of the things is when you go into this environment to move in the environment, you can't actually see very well because you've got a veil in front of your face. So if you were going to reconstruct this in a virtual world, you would basically have to make going into that inner environment, if you were walking into it with your HMD, it would have to come hazy at that point. The reason the veils were across people's faces was so they could pay attention to their bodies and pay attention to the sound. 2 minutes, that's fine. I'm so close to there. So emulating this physical sensation of the interactive behavior, which is needed to activate the environment, the physical act of walking, would be possible with Nietzsche's real-world user environment. But then I think we step into the unknown, because as I've said, you could play, you could do single user activity quite easily. One of the things about this installation was actually composing a sound world. It wasn't just arbitrarily generating it. So if you got skilled at it, you could really nuance it like playing different instruments. Fine. You could do that with one person. There's a lot of collective interactivity on online games now. You could possibly do it with 3 or 4. But there's another level of interactivity, and I don't know whether this would be possible, but would love it to be, which was that one of the collective interactivity signals was proximity. So if you had the proximity of 2 of these figures in the coloured costumes, that itself would change the sound. So one would change the sound of another. And then in a different environment, this one would change the sound of that one. So it was actually incredibly complex, and nobody, apart from Ruth Gibson, actually, who worked in it quite a lot, got it, as it were. So that's an area of research which I think probably steps us into the unknown and might be worth working on. So that's really, in a way, you could develop this world in VR. You could get a sense of kinesthetic involvement. Sound does that in a virtual world as well as in a real world. But I think when you get to the other side of things, you might be in trouble. However, if one was to try to address these, I think you'd probably solve quite a lot of the problems that we're having with virtual museums, with the feeling sensation. And you could preserve some of the moments of choreographic practice from the past, which are the moment I just looked at from the outside on a screen. So it's a starting point. It's a dream. I haven't got anywhere with it, but it's a starting point. So that's me. Done.